I'm Cullen Lucas, and these are DUOS, the mini podcasts where I talk to composers and artists about their music in a straightforward, interesting, and accessible way. Think of us as the anti-program note. Oh, and just a quick reminder that this is actually the second half of a two-part interview with Mark, and this was just such an interesting conversation that we actually did run a little bit longer than our normal time period, but we hope you enjoy. So one of the pieces that probably, or I guess movies that sticks out most just from when you first told me about the tales of Miklós Rózsa, basically, was Spellbound, and there was this concerto, and then it was changed around, and there are all these additions, and then there's music that's been lost, and we don't know where it is, but we do know where it is, and we can't get it. And it's such an awesome, interesting story. Can you kind of lead us through the music of Spellbound?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I don't remember exactly when production started on Spellbound, but I know it was released in 1945, but there were a lot of production delays. So probably he got a phone call from David O. Selznick, the producer, around 1943, late 1943 and 1944. And basically the picture was almost complete, and he needed someone to score it. And apparently, whoever he wanted to use was let out of contract, and he didn't have the right person that he wanted at that time. So he was looking for sort of a free agent. This is back before a lot of union regulations were in place, and so studios actually had big contracts over stars. So it's not like you could just be an actor and decide to do an MGM picture and then do a Selznick picture and then do a Universal and then do one for RKO. It wasn't like that back then. It was more like you signed a contract to a studio, and then you were that studio's
locked in.
Like property for however your contract was, you know? So David O. Selznick was a super eccentric director that had a string of amazing hits and Academy Award wins. And at that time, he had a real stronghold over a lot of the talent. Like, so for instance, for Spellbound, at his disposal, he had Alfred Hitchcock in the studio. So Alfred Hitchcock was the director. And then he had Gregory Peck, who played Atticus Finch. And then he had Ingrid Bergman, who was hot off of Casablanca, right? So, I mean, like, he had the best talent. And so he and Hitchcock, who had worked together, Hitchcock was in the middle, I think, of his pictures that he had to do for Selznick. I think the first they did together was 1941's Rebecca, and that's like one of the highest rated noirs of all time. It's really an incredible movie. But he wanted Hitchcock to focus on the idea of madness, because apparently David O. Selznick was working himself ragged and sort of like had these sort of mental breakdowns. And this is at the very beginning of psychoanalysis, when this started becoming popular. And so Selznick was like, psychoanalysis really helped me through a lot of my, mental health issues. So I want us to really dig deep and find some source material that we can manipulate to tell a good story about psychoanalysis. So Spellbound, the whole thesis of it is madness. And so when they finished it up, because, normally production is finished on a film, and then you bring the composer in and say, okay, this is what we have, what do you envision? And here's what we envision, and here are some temporary tracks that we're thinking of. Can you write something like this? So they brought in Rózsa, and they said, we don't trust you, we don't know you, we just want you to basically sort of audition. So can you do a scene for us and see if we like it? So they said, let's have you do the scene where madness is very obvious. So it's this scene, it's the famous razor blade scene. And it's where Gregory Peck, who has amnesia, so he can't remember who he is at all, he sleepwalks in sort of like this dreamy state where he's floating in between any real consciousness. And he goes to the kitchen, and the bathroom, and it hasn't been confirmed if he's a killer or not. We have no idea. And he's shaving his face, and then he holds the razor blade over Ingrid Bergman, in like this terrifying trance, and the razor blade is casting a shadow on her face and on her neck, and it's just like really, really scary. And then he hears some noise downstairs, and then he walks downstairs, and then that's sort of the scary part of the scene. But so David Selznick and Hitchcock both said that they wanted Rózsa to explore a, quote, new sound to represent madness, right? Like, can you come up with something new? And so he said, oh, I have the perfect idea. I have this thing that I've always wanted to use, which is called the theremin. And of course, the theremin was invented after World War I, right? And it was basically not yet iconically associated with like ghost sounds and music, but it's the instrument with two antennae, and one of them controls the pitch and one of them controls the volume, right? And so it basically is incredibly difficult to play because you're not touching the instrument, and it's free intonation, right? So incredibly difficult to play, but he said it's just scary enough to be that new sound. So he got some players together and they recorded it, and he got the one guy in Los Angeles that had a theremin that could play it at the time, and apparently could play it, was not really proficient enough. So what they did is they found a microphone that was sort of had a narrow enough scope that it would only pick up the theremin. And Rózsa sat an oboe player next to the thereminist and had that oboe player softly play the part. So that way it was a pitch reference for the theremin player.
Oh, man.
So, I mean, talk about being emasculated in that moment, but I guess he really, really wanted that theremin sound, you know?
Right.
And what he did actually want, he didn't actually originally want the theremin. He wanted the sound of a theremin, but he didn't want to have to deal with all of the nonsense that obviously would come with recording it. So there was, of course, another instrument invented around the same time, the martineau. And he really wanted to use the martineau, which is basically a keyed theremin. Yeah. So, you know, wherever the key is touching on the string, it's going to produce that pitch. But it also has what we call a ribbon, where you can put your finger inside the ribbon and pull the ribbon, and you have a dummy keyboard in front of it. And if you pull your finger to the F sharp, right, and wiggle your arm around, you can still get the kind of warble.
Yeah.
That's not an F sharp. Anybody listening? Sorry about that. But, so that's kind of that's sort of what he wanted to use, but he had to settle on the theremin. And of course, it did come with a host of tricks and issues, but they resolved it that way. So they showed it to Selznick, and he loved it. And he was like, oh, this is amazing. And he thought in his mind that he had like almost exclusivity rights to this instrument, right? Like, oh, this is going to be my cash cow, right? I'm the guy that you know, first brought the theremin to the big screen, you know. Yeah. But unfortunately, at that point, there was production delays because they still had not filmed one crucial scene, which is where Gregory Peck is being psychoanalyzed by Ingrid Bergman and her character's mentor, Dr. Bruloff. So the two of them are psychoanalyzing him, and as he's explaining it, there's a dream sequence that goes along with it. And that dream sequence, they flew in Salvador Dali to direct that scene. And apparently it cost millions and millions of dollars. And at one point I did the conversion, and it was just like a huge amount of money that this scene cost. Plus many of the parts of the sequence are just one shot of the camera going straight, and then everything happens around it, and everything's made of paper mache. So if you rip your props, or there's one prop that is being cut, and once it's cut, you have to redo it again. Dali has to repaint the whole thing if you want a second shot. So it cost a ton of money, and it put production way behind. And in the meantime, Rózsa was still a free agent, right? So he got to do another picture. So he did another picture in the meantime, and this one was called The Lost Weekend. And The Lost Weekend, it was already in post-production. They just needed the score, and they were showing it to test audiences, and I think it did have some music in it, and they thought it was a comedy because it's this guy who, the reason the weekend is lost is he's blackout drunk, right? And it's supposed to be a drama thriller, but everyone thought it was a comedy because, you know, when he drinks himself stupid and passes out and knocks over things, right, people were laughing. And then later on, when they realized that this is a very serious drama-filled story, audiences were turned off. You know, they thought it was Judd Apatow, and then they got, you know, something serious. Like, what is this? You know? And so they, unfortunately, they were ready to scrap the picture, and they showed it to Rózsa, and he said, oh, no, we can fix this. And also, I have the perfect sound to describe madness. So he actually used the theremin again, and Rózsa believes that the score to The Lost Weekend is actually superior to Spellbound. It's not as iconic. I don't really believe that. It's sort of like Alan Menken saying that his best work is The Hunchback. You know, like it's a great score, but you know, I prefer Spellbound, but you know, he's entitled to certainly his own opinion about his own work, right?
Yeah.
So that picture got released before Spellbound because of Spellbound's delays. And so here's a couple of anecdotal stories that'll help set the stage for how crazy his relationship with Selznick. So the first is he gets a call from Selznick's secretary when they're already finished wrapping up all of the time in the studio. And she says, hey, so we looked up the records, and apparently they used, for Rebecca in 1941, they used 12 or 13 violins. And for Spellbound, you only used 12. So Mr. Selznick would like you to redo the whole recording process with a 13th violinist. And Rózsa's exact words in his biography are, whether 12 or 13 violinists made a difference, only Selznick could tell. But it was his money, so he went and did it. So they redid it. And so then The Lost Weekend came out. So he gets a phone call again from Selznick's secretary. And you can tell Rózsa's pretty angry by this response. And in this response, I'm going to improvise what Rózsa said because there's a list of instruments involved. And every time that Rózsa told this story, every interview I've heard, he makes them up too. So just know that this isn't his exact wording. But the secretary calls and says, Mr. Selznick wants to know if you used the theremin in The Lost Weekend. And Rózsa says, oh, why, yes, I did. And I also used the trumpet and the piccolo and the snare drum, and goodbye, and hangs up the phone. So the final slap in the face between their relationship that really took it to the breaking point is it was time for scoring to begin on the next Selznick picture. And by the way, this is after March or whenever the Academy Awards are, and Rózsa wins Best Picture. Wins the best score, right? So he won the Academy Award in 45. So then he's set to do the next feature. Well, in his mind, he thinks that he's going to be asked. So then they say, hey, Rózsa, we have some great news for you. Good job with your Academy Award win. So we're going to give you the opportunity to audition for the next film, and we're going to have you and several others have a competition. You're all going to score the same scene, and if you get it, then you can do the rest of the picture. And if not, we'll still retain the rights to your material, and we might use it anyway, you know? And he was like, no, I'm done with you. I'm done with you. Sorry, I'm done with you. So that was the sort of the end of the Spellbound, the movie music, you know?
Yeah.
So then, of course, now you mentioned it gets a little bit more convoluted. So, of course, his concert music was still being published by Breitkopf and Härtel, but his film music was published by a different publisher. So the publisher calls him and says, hey, you know, you won the Academy Award. It's going to be really popular. We're going to get a lot of concert performances if you put together like a suite for concert use. So that's what he set out to do. So he put together, I think it's like a 12-minute sort of arrangement of the best themes and the best scenes. And they were all ready to release it. And, well, they did release it. And he looked in the publishing catalog and saw that his piece had a different name than what he had sent with it. So it's just a simple concert suite, but it was called the Spellbound Concerto. And so he calls his publisher and is like, why did you call it a concerto? And they said, oh, doesn't it sound fancier? It sounds better, right? Concerto. And so, of course, this drove Rózsa crazy. And he was like, well, forget it. I'm just going to turn it into a concerto. So he actually went back and took a lot of the main melodies and threw it into the piano and made it into a piano concerto, a one movement, you know, through composed romp through the best themes of Spellbound. and it's basically the same material from the original suite, but they're both called Spellbound Concerto. So there's Spellbound Concerto, suite for orchestra, and then there's Spellbound Concerto, actual concerto for orchestra and piano. So those both came out in 1946, and then the chamber version also came out in 1946, and that chamber version actually was not done by Rózsa, but interestingly enough, and I have to double check my facts here because I'm not really that. Okay, Alfonso de Arteaga, that's who is the arranger. And if I had to guess, this was probably done for a concert that featured Martineau's Fantasia, because apparently Martineau's Fantasia had the same strange instrumentation, including the theremin. So that's probably how he got the rights to do it, is he wanted, additional material. And because all of a sudden the whole world, through Spellbound, right, because it was a big blockbuster, knew what the theremin was and was interested in it, of course it was included on a piece or on a concert for that in New York. So, the theremin ever since then has sort of been associated with madness, and that's probably what happened to that. And you would think that that would be the end of the material. But then Rózsa again returned to the material in the 80s when he was approached by the Pierce-Jonas duo, and they are a piano duo based on the East Coast. And they said, we want you to write us a couple of piano concertos, of double piano concertos that we can play with orchestra. And so Rózsa said, he used a quote from Rossini to describe how he felt about composition at that time. And the quote, I'm going to get it wrong word for word, but it's basically like, the older I got, I was chasing the melodies. Whereas when I was young, the melodies were chasing me. Like Rossini, wrote more than one opera sometimes in a year for like 13 years straight, right? So like he had a lot of ideas. I'm sure he couldn't get them all on paper. That's how Rózsa was writing 100 film scores, in those couple of decades. That must have been what it felt like to him. But when he got older, he said, I really want to take this commission, but I need to recycle some material. So what he did is he took out 3 film scores that were set in New England and crafted it into a 13-minute piece called the New England Concerto. And so I've always wanted to do that piece. It's a lot shorter than the Spellbound Fantasy that I'm about to describe, and it's much more succinct and gets the same point across. It's a really terrific piece. But of course, that's just the pendant piece to the big one that he wrote, which is he returned to the Spellbound material, and he had the actual scores. And so from the sessions, and he actually included in this new piece that he wrote material that didn't even make it into the film, like extended versions of things. So this is like the most comprehensive concert piece of that material available. It's like a 25-minute romp through the film score and it's a Spellbound Concerto Fantasy for 2 pianos and orchestra. And they were performed in Texas. They were performed in London. The Queen saw the piece. It won a bunch of awards. They won a bunch of awards. It was recorded. Varese Sarabande has it now. It was recorded by the Utah Symphony. And because this was released when Rózsa was not really conducting anymore. Basically, once he was out of the studios, he wasn't really conducting too much of his own stuff anymore. Other people were interpreting his works. And then it got, from what I understand, the duo pianists that created those, or that performed those, the Pierce-Jonas duo, they are the ones with the music. And I've reached out to their management many times and had some correspondences given to them. And unfortunately, I've received radio silence. So that's about as much sleuthing as I've done. So that's what happened to that material. So I'm still holding out a little bit of hope that I will get a chance to do that work one day, because that's like the comprehensive concert Spellbound piece, Spellbound Concerto fan.
Yeah, because that just sounds like it's got such an incredible synthesis. It's a shame that we can't hear that aside from the handful of recordings that exist, we can't hear that now.
Mm-hmm.
So for people that aren't super familiar with like Spellbound or the noir films that Rocha scored or any of his concert music, are there any like hallmarks of like Rocha's compositional style, things that people could listen to specific or listen for specifically whenever they're checking out his music for the first time?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, his music is super dramatic. He one of the things that is sort of considered a Roja fault is that he overscores. So there are times where in post production they have to turn down the score so much because it obscures the dialogue, no matter how soft you make it, and you can actually hear the jumping of the volume like up and down, and that kind of like pulls you out sometimes. And he was pretty good at Mickey Mousing around that. Like, you know, sometimes the score would be super dramatic, and then it would come to a point where the dialogue has to absolutely be heard, and it would be radio silence for a moment, and then the orchestra would come in after the line was spoken, and that like, you know, would be even more shocking. So you can listen for how dramatic the music. You can listen to how, unfortunately, probably more than you should, you find yourself listening to the music and enjoying it.
The
And then
music
there's
more than the show.
yeah, well, and that's probably my only criticism of like someone like John Williams too. You know, I mean, like sometimes I'm like, oh, I love that theme, or oh, this, you know, Yoda's theme makes this scene. It's what makes me tear up so much. The theme, you know. And I'm going, well, wait a minute, hold on.
What just
So
happened?
yeah, you know. So Roja has sort of the similar pathos to his music. He loves the brass. He loves that warbly sort of sound from the noir era, what you can listen to whenever madness is described. A lot of composers, obviously, they were listening to each other at that time, so all the contemporaries used the same sort of thing, either a theremin or a musical saw or the vibro, yeah, or the vibraphone with the motors running, blah blah
Yeah.
blah 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 blah, and celeste and all of these sounds that sort of warble around and sound like madness, whole tone scale, up and down, harp. Whenever anybody gets hit on the head, and that happened a lot because, you know, in the noir era, instead of focusing on the dashing police officer, or, you know, the hero, it usually was sort of a detective or a private eye or someone who had a drinking problem and, you know,
like
couldn't quite,
anti-hero.
yeah, totally anti-hero archetype, you know. And so, you know, that would happen a lot, where they would find themselves in trouble, or they would find themselves hit over the head, and there would be these sort of weird flourishes like that. And then the other thing, like if you listen to the very end of the Firebird Suite from Stravinsky, you know, it's just major chords that ascend and then go back down the same way, starting on a B major. So planing major chords, that is really common in Roja as well. So you'll hear major chords that go from low to high, or like, you know, the trumpets will play a melody and they'll play it in major chords exactly together. And so that's sort of a hallmark. And it makes it really exciting. And that's the same thing in John Williams' work. Like, you know, in Star Wars, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-ba-ba-dee-ba. That's just all major chords. And so
Well, it
that's
sounds like there's a lot to the way he wrote and his scoring that is going to be somewhat familiar territory to anyone who's heard, you know, modern film music, that they can still latch on to and find those little points where like, oh, I can listen to this. This is not completely new territory for me.
totally.
That's one of the things I think that, like, because I didn't know a whole lot about film noir or Onager or Rocha or any of those contemporaries from that age. As I started listening to their music, I was like, oh, this is where all this music that we have now is kind of coming from. You can kind of like, you can hear the lineage like from that time period to now, which is really, really cool.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, is there anything? Well, first of all, if people want to know more about you or Rocha, what are some resources they can tune into or find you at?
So a great resource for Rózsa is the Miklós Rózsa Society's website, and that's just his name, and then I believe it's .org, miklósrózsa.org. And that society's website has, it's miklósrózsa.org, and to spell that, that's miklósrozsa.org. And that actually has a bunch of articles written by society members that are very well cited and very well put together. Opinions about certain pieces, and there's archived threads that you can read. Like one of them was on where's the music for Spellbound Concerto Fantasy and the New England Concerto, where is it? And so I read that and was fascinated, and that's what led me down the rabbit hole of emailing all the people that I could and sort of doing my sleuthing. So that's a great resource. And then also, if you're interested in the holdings of Rózsa, there's two interesting things that you can look up. One of which is the Rózsa Library in Syracuse University. So a lot of his personal effects are in that library, and you can actually look through the contents of each of the boxes and see his effects and see which scores are there. And some of them have been digitized, and all of them are available for a librarian to go in and get you anything that you want. Same for myself. You can visit me at markalpizar.com.
Cool. Well, I'm very aware of your time, and thanks for being the guinea pig for these duos. Hopefully we can have you back talking on some other music and some other composers, because I'm sure it's not just Rózsa. I'm sure there's a wealth of other fascinating composers that are sometimes overlooked or not just common knowledge, and we'd love to dive into more of that eventually. But thank you so much for your time and coming and hanging out for a while and all the chatting.
Thanks, Colin. Best of luck, and thanks again for having me.
Yeah, thanks again, man. See ya.
All right, take care.